Hey everyone, I'm Aubrey, a Codecademy coach and web developer based out of Colorado. Today we're going to be practicing and learning about the visual rules concepts in our Learn CSS course. I've pre-built a project for us to work with that we'll be adding styles to. We'll work with properties that affect text and some that give decoration to the page. And this is what the page will look like when we start. Very bare bones, and this is what the page will look like when we're finished. Before getting started, I want to go over the key concepts we'll cover, which are CSS declarations and rules, and using CSS properties to change the look of our sites. By the end of the video, you should be able to create CSS declarations, construct CSS rules, change the styling of text using multiple CSS properties, apply foreground and background color to elements, adjust the opacity of an element, and use an image as the background of an element. Before we dive into the project I built for us today, let's take a closer look at the HTML of the site. We have a navigation element with an unordered list element that contains list items that are wrapped around anchor links. We have a main element that has an H1 heading, paragraph, and an image element wrapped around an anchor link as well. And now let's check out what that HTML looks like in our editor. And by the way, I'm using Visual Studio Code as my editor. And in the editor, you can see our navigation element with links and our main element with our heading, our paragraph, and our anchor link wrapping an image. And now let's get started. I want to go over some CSS structures first, including how to create a CSS declaration. A CSS declaration is a key-value pair where the key is the CSS property name and the value is the corresponding value for said CSS property. CSS declarations can be applied to all elements to change or set styles. The property and value are separated by a colon, and a semicolon is used to close the declaration. And I want you to see a more specific example. Here we have the CSS property name color and the CSS value yellow separated by a colon and closed with a semicolon. The entire line of code is a CSS declaration. The next CSS structure you need to be familiar with is a CSS rule or rule set. A CSS rule, which is also called a rule set, is the CSS selector plus curly braces plus any CSS declarations between the curly braces. The curly braces with the CSS declarations inside is called a declaration block, and the entire code block is the CSS rule. In this example, we have an H1 rule where H1 is the selector and the declaration block contains a color yellow declaration to be applied to the H1 element. And now let's move on to setting and changing styles using different CSS properties. The project we're using is mostly HTML. It's our skeleton for the project. I've already linked a style sheet to the HTML right here. And this project is a basic landing page, again, with a navigation section, a main content section that contains a heading right here, informational content, and a hyperlink that is wrapping an image element. I added a style to the image already, a height of 50 pixels, and without this height, the image is very large and would distract from the page and our learning as a whole. Again, our starting page is super plain, and we're going to start by styling the text on the page. I want to change the typeface of our entire page, and we can do this by using the font family property. The default font family, which is usually Times New Roman, will be applied to the entire page unless otherwise stated. And there are a few ways to change the typeface. So let's start by adding a rule for the element we want to style. I'll target the body element for this, as font family is an inherited style, meaning that any elements nested inside the body element will inherit the font family I declare. So body, font family. And to help me decide what typeface I like to use, I want to check out a WebSafe fonts reference site. This resource tells me what percentage of Windows and Mac operating systems have these specific fonts installed, and I want to pick a typeface that has a high percentage for both because the browser uses fonts that are installed on a user's operating system. If the font family declared in the CSS is not installed on a user's operating system, the browser will use the default font family or the set CSS generic font such as serif or sans serif. So previous to recording this, I have already decided that I want a sans serif font, and looking over these percentages for sans serif, let's see. I'm going to go ahead and choose Arial right here. I'll add Arial as the font family value on the body rule. Oop. Arial. Save that, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at our changes. We can see the change that the font family made, and that indeed it changed the font family for all elements nested inside the body element. Another way to change a typeface that will not require the font to be installed on a user's operating system is by using a link to a font and using it in our project. For this method, we first want to go to a site that stores and serves fonts to us. And then we're going to pick a typeface that we like. Here, again, I've already decided what font I want. I want Josephine Sans, so I'm going to select this font, and then I'm going to copy the link element given to us. And then we're going to paste this link before our style sheet link. We want the font link before our style sheet link because we'll use this font family in our CSS, and as such, the font needs to be loaded before our CSS uses it. And then we'll use the font family declaration like this font site tells us to, and we're going to copy that and then paste it into the declaration, or paste the declaration into the rule we want. I'm going to replace the current font family declaration in the body rule set with the new one I just copied. And let's take a look how that looks in the browser. Great, this is looking a little more styled now, and I like this font. And I want you all to notice this. You can see here that we have quotes around our font family value we're currently using. But if you remember, we did not use quotes around the Arial value. I see many developers having an issue with deciding when or when not to use quotes, and you can use them if you wish around a single font family name and or names that have spaces, as long as you use the quotes consistently. However, we do not want to use quotes around generic font family names like serif or sans serif like we see right here. Also, keep in mind that the official specifications for CSS recommends that font family values with spaces be wrapped in quotes. And next, I want to change the default text size for some of these elements. To do this, we're going to use the font size property. And to start, I want to change the size of the H1 element. I want it to be more noticeable. So I'll make it bigger by creating a rule for the H1 and giving it a font size of 40 pixels. Oops, font size 40 pixels. Okay, definitely more noticeable. And now I want to change the font size of our paragraph element. Again, I'll create a rule, this time for the paragraph element, and give it a font size of 20 pixels. And do know that the process of finding font sizes you like may take more trial and error than shown here. I definitely played around with the font sizes before creating this lesson. And now let's check out that change on our site. Great. I am liking how this is looking now. And one mistake I see often regarding choosing heading elements and their font sizes is that developers will sometimes choose heading elements for their default styles instead of declaring styles in the CSS. And as we learned in the HTML structure lesson and video, we should be choosing elements based on their semantic meaning and not based on their default styling. For example, I could have used an H3 element instead of a paragraph element on line 18, as the default font size is closer to what I want for this text. However, this is not best practice, and the meaning of the element in the context of our page would get muddled. I chose an H1 for the main heading of the page, with a paragraph element for the block of descriptive text under, and then changed the size of the text via CSS. Now I want to style this paragraph a bit more by changing the font weight of the paragraph element. And here I'll use the font weight bold declaration on our paragraph rule. Font weight bold. Perfect. So another note on using semantic meaningful elements versus styling with CSS. You may have come across elements that use font weight bold by default, like the strong or bring attention to elements. We should use the strong element to indicate that a piece of text is particularly important. For example, do not pet bears where the word not is in boldface, as it's more important than the surrounding text. And we should use the bring attention to element to draw attention to a piece of text. This is particularly useful to draw attention to keywords. Right here, right here. So for example, while learning about geology, take note of keywords like plate tectonics and mid-oceanic ridges, where plate tectonics and mid-oceanic ridges are displayed in bold to bring more attention to those keywords. We don't want to use either of these elements in the case of our block of text for their default styling. Rather, we should declare font weight bold on our element, as the bold styling in this case is strictly for presentational purposes. Now I want to change the alignment of our text using the text align property in this main section. The text and all elements are aligned left by default. Here I want to see how the elements inside my main element would look if they were centered. So I'm going to add a main rule with a text align property and use center as the value. And although this property name is text align, it will actually align content including text inside a parent block element. In this case, the parent element is the main element right here. And I'm not really feeling this centered text here. So I'm going to go ahead and try a different value. And instead of center here, I'm going to choose right. I'm liking this better now. And next I want to change the foreground color, which just means the color of the text and any text decorations. So this includes bullets here and the underline of our anchor links and this text over here. I'll use the color property with named colors, meaning color keywords, to make the text a different color. I'll add a color declaration of color tomato to the body rule set. So color tomato. And color is an inherited property, just like font family. So we're expecting to see this color on all of our text and text decorations. Okay, this is not exactly what I was expecting. If you take a look at the navigation section, you can see that the anchor links with our text right here are not being styled completely with the color declaration we just set, even though color is an inherited style. And this is because by default, the browser has a style of color blue applied to the anchor links. In our own CSS, which is loaded after the browser CSS, we do not have a CSS declaration on our anchor link rule set to override the default browser styling for color. So I'm going to add a rule set for the anchor links with a declaration of color tomato. So color tomato, and this should override that blue default styling. Perfect. This is what I was expecting. And now I want to add some background colors to our body, which spans the entire width of the page and the entire height actually, and the navigation section. So this element, which spans across the entire width of the page. And to change the background color property, I'm going to use named colors again. For the nav element, I'm going to use background color black. So nav rule set with a background color, background color property and black as the value. And then I'm also going to add a background color light cyan to our body rule set. Background color. Light cyan. Awesome. Okay, I want to style this nav element a little bit more with the opacity property, which will change how opaque the element is. I'll give the nav rule set an opacity of 0.5, which says to set the opacity to 50%. So opacity 0.5. And we can set the opacity from 0% to 100% using decimal notation 0.0 to 1.0. Yikes! It looks like the opacity property affected the text inside our nav element. So right now I'm on the documentation for opacity, and looking over this documentation, it seems that when opacity is applied to an element, the entire element, including its children, is affected. And there are a few ways to solve this issue. The first is by using positioning, which you'll learn about in later lessons on display and positioning. The other has to do with setting the background color to include opacity, and you'll learn more about this solution in our color lessons in our CSS course. But for now, I'm going to use the background color solve by specifying a color format with opacity built in, and that will only affect the element it's declared on and not its children. I'm going to comment this out right now because we don't need it and use a different background color declaration. Color with our color format that has opacity built in. And this is just setting our background color to black with an opacity of 50% again, using decimal notation. Okay, and this is what I was initially expecting. So for opacity, I would aim to use it as a way to make an image lighter or darker by using the property on an element that overlays said image, by using the opacity on an image element itself to change its transparency, or on a text element you want to be more transparent. And I want to test opacity again, this time on our image element here. And for that, I'm going to add an opacity of 50% again on our image rule set. So opacity 0.5, the decimal notation for 50%. Great, it looks like it worked as expected this time for our arrow image. However, our landing page is still looking very plain, so I want to give the entire page some decoration by adding a background image on the body using the background image property. I'll add a background image declaration to the body rule set. So background image. Perfect. And note that if we have both a background color and a background image declaration, they will not both be applied. Rather, the declaration physically lower in the CSS file will be applied, so I'm putting the background image declaration lower. If for some reason the image doesn't load, the background color will be applied instead. And the syntax here looks a bit different than in our other properties. Here in the value we have the URL keyword followed by parentheses right here. And in the parentheses, we'll put our path to the image we want to use as the background in quotes. This path can be a locally stored image saved to the project or a link to an external image. Here I'm using a link to an external image. Great, this is looking much better now, but I think we should change the text color for the nav and the main sections. And I'm going to change both the color declarations in the body rule set and the anchor rule set to color white instead of color tomato. Right here and color white again. Much better. So our site has come a long way just by adding some styling. And next, I challenge you all to learn more about the properties and concepts we discussed in this lesson. Check out the linked resources in the description box that corresponds to this video to help with this challenge. And to recap, we learned how to create CSS declarations, what a CSS rule is, how to style text using the font family, font size, font weight, and text align properties, how to apply foreground and background colors, how and when to adjust opacity, and how to use an image as the background of an element. Thanks for joining me today. See you next time, and happy coding!